Good evening and welcome to Podcast 3.4a. In this podcast, we're going to take a look at what shapes an ecosystem, community interactions, how populations grow, and some things that limit the growth of population. For Kalani High School, this is the Allaire Report, and I'm your host, Mr. Allaire. Now, before we can talk about what shapes an ecosystem, I think it's important to understand what an ecosystem is. An ecosystem is a collection of all the organisms that live in a particular place together with their non-living environment. Now, there are two different types of factors that can affect an ecosystem: biotic factors and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are biological influences on organisms within an ecosystem. So this could include organisms that eat other organisms or organisms that compete to eat another organism. On the other hand, abiotic factors are, you guessed it, non-living or physical factors that affect an ecosystem. So abiotic factors within an ecosystem can include things like temperature, precipitation, humidity, nutrient availability, and sunlight. The area in which an organism lives that includes biotic and abiotic factors is commonly referred to as a habitat. In the past, our focus has been primarily on the abiotic factors affecting an ecosystem. So let's spend some time talking about biotic factors, particularly competition. Competition occurs when organisms attempt to use an ecological resource in the same place at the same time. And when this occurs, you can get a couple of different things. On one hand, you can have predation. And predation is basically when one organism eats another organism, where you have a prey and predator relationship. Now, for a predator can be either active or passive. Prey is just whatever gets eaten. On the other hand, you can have what's called a symbiotic relationship. And this is a relationship in which two species live closely together. And symbiosis can be broken down further into things like mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. And we're going to spend a couple of minutes taking a look at each one of these in just a moment. Again, those three types of symbiosis are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Now, mutualism is when both species benefit from the relationship. For instance, as bees collect pollen, they help to fertilize flowers. Thus, both organisms get some type of benefit. In commensalism, one species benefits from the relationship and the other is neither helped nor harmed. So, for instance, barnacles don't hurt whales, but the barnacles do benefit from the constant flow of water and the constant supply of food. Parasitism, on the other hand, is when one organism lives on or inside another organism, which is commonly referred to as the host, and harms it. Fleas, ticks, lice, and tapeworms are all found in and on mammals, and they will weaken their host, but they usually won't kill it. It's not in a parasite's interest to kill the host, because if the host dies, then the parasite dies. Over a long enough period of time, and given enough resources, populations of organisms will usually grow. And there are three important characteristics of a population that can affect this growth, and they are the geographic distribution, the density, and the growth rate. Geographic distribution describes the area inhabited by a population. For instance, elephants need a large geographic area, whereas bacteria need a very small geographic area. Population density refers to the number of organisms within a unit area. Again, elephants may have a very low density. There could be just a few elephants within a large area, whereas there could be billions of bacteria on something like your fingernail. And growth rate is how quickly individual organisms are added or removed from a population. In other words, it's how quickly they are born and how quickly they die. Birth and death of organisms can have a drastic effect on the population growth. If the birth rate is greater than the death rate, a population will grow. If the birth rate equals the death rate, then a population will usually remain about the same size. If the birth rate is less than the death rate, then a population will shrink. There are factors other than birth and death that will affect the size of a population, and these are immigration with an I and emigration with an E. Immigration is the movement of individuals into an area. Organisms can immigrate into an area for a whole variety of reasons, including weather and food. These very same factors could actually cause organisms to emigrate or move out of an area. For instance, if the weather changes drastically or food becomes scarce, animals may choose to move to a different area. As I mentioned earlier, given enough time and resources and protection from predators and disease, a population will usually increase. And if these resources are unlimited, then a population will grow exponentially. Exponential growth of a population will only occur under ideal conditions. Remember, those conditions include when space and food are abundant and there is ample protection from predators and disease. Now, as we've talked about, this type of population growth doesn't occur for very long. As a population increases, the amount of food and the amount of competition also increases, and we'll talk more about that later. As the resources for a particular population of organisms decrease, the growth of that population slows down and can eventually stop. This is referred to as logistic growth, and this occurs when a population's growth slows or stops following a period of exponential growth. And although this really can't be quantified, an environment, an ecosystem, will usually have what's called a carrying capacity, and that's the number of individuals that an environment can support. Under ideal conditions, a population will grow exponentially, but in the real world, we will have logistic growth. And that's because there are a variety of what are called limiting factors that affect the growth of a population. And limiting factors are living and non-living factors that cause a population growth to decrease. There are 5 limiting factors that we're going to talk about together today, and they are competition, predation, parasitism and disease, climate extremes, and human presence. Now, you'll notice that the 5 limiting factors that we have here are color-coded, and that's because we're going to take a look at some of these limiting factors that make up 2 subgroups. Our first 3 limiting factors, the competition, predation, parasitism, and disease, are what are known as density-dependent factors. And these are limiting factors that depend on population size. So as the population gets bigger, the competition gets bigger. As a population gets bigger, there can be more predators. As a population gets bigger, there's a chance for more parasitism and disease, especially because if animals are malnourished, they are more prone to diseases. Now, of course, if we have density-dependent factors, then that kind of leads us to believe that there are density-independent factors. And density-independent factors affect all populations in similar ways, regardless of the population size. And some density-independent factors include things like unusual weather, natural disasters, and seasonal cycles. No matter the size of a population, whether it's very large or very small, things like a forest fire or seasons changing from summer to fall to winter are going to affect it exactly the same way. That's what a density-independent factor is. Now, although human beings tend to affect larger populations a little bit more, human intervention, human presence can be considered a density-independent factor. Things that we do, such as damming rivers and clear-cutting forests, will affect a population of organisms no matter how big or how small. That's going to wrap it up for this podcast. I'll see you next time on the Allaire Report.